Okay, so this panel looks into the multifaceted relationship between gender and climate change. It explores both the profound material consequences, particularly for women in the global south, as well as the pivotal role that women play in climate action and policy. Our panelists bring diverse perspectives and experiences to the discussion, shedding light on the key aspects. So firstly, they'll be looking at the disproportionate impacts of climate change on women, particularly in the global south. Also the intersection between race and global economic disparities. So it will extend beyond gender, looking into intersectionalities, looking at caste and age. And it'll also look at the women's role in climate action. So recognizing the critical role that women play in climate action and policy. And it'll look at the achievements and contributions of women in this field. Finally, they'll look at climate justice and gender justice, emphasizing on the need for climate justice to include gender justice. And by addressing these crucial topics and featuring speakers with various perspectives, we hope to promote a holistic understanding of the gender-climate intersection and inspire meaningful action and discussion towards a more just and sustainable future. So our first speaker, Inge, she is currently the Executive Director and co-founder of Global Choices. This is a USA and UK non-for-profit, and she's focused on understanding climate systems risk. And so this is looking at the prioritization and protection of the Central Arctic Ocean ice. And so Global Choices is female-led and genuinely intergenerational, and works with 60 stellar women who all work together across 33 countries. And she has a passion for climate justice and protecting the poorest, and agrees that the most effective tool to change our outer reality is what we achieve inwardly. So yeah, do you think I have a 5-minute introduction?
Thank you very much. That's really good. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Really, I was in Iceland this morning and I was determined not to miss it. So I was just very grateful that the weather improved and we could get out and I could be here with you. Can I just ask, how many of you are actively involved or studying climate or sustainability in any shape or form? Really? And how many of you are doing gender studies? Cool. Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, that's the exciting thing, is that this is the big trend, right? Climate, and it's the big existential risk we all face. I'll just a little bit of backtracking. My background is actually in corporate strategy. And as a strategist, you look at trends and what's happening in the world. And certainly, it might be helpful to you to hear a little bit about where the emergence of gender really and climate really started becoming much stronger. And I don't know if many of you remember 2015. You probably were not really into COPs and things at that stage, but in 2015 was the Paris COP. And that was a landmark COP for many reasons. But particularly it was led by Christiana Figueres. And I, at the time, was working at the Elders, and for President Mary Robinson, she was the climate envoy for the UN. And together with Laurence Toubiana in France, who was the French envoy for climate, they determined that every single working committee would have a gender balance, which was a first, I can tell you. And I think that this was a very significant reason why this COP was a success, because it was a new form of diplomacy which really revolved around collaboration. It was around compassion. It was around inclusion, because there was this gender balance in the working committees. And I think that also was carried through to the SDGs, which were agreed, the 2030 agenda, in the same year, and for the same qualities that were beginning to be included in these negotiations. And that was not just women, but it was also men like Paul Polman, and who, when I talk about the feminine energy, it's not actually female, it's that energy that is willing to set self-interest aside for the common good, and that understands oneness, and understands that there isn't actually an other, right? If I harm you, I'm harming myself. And it was bringing this new type of thinking into those negotiations. That was a really important, this sort of collaborative diplomacy. And there are, I don't know if, and many of you, I don't even know if it's part of your curriculum actually. Do you know the Antonio and, let me get the names right, Gersmer's book, The Athena Doctrine? If you don't know it, it's worth reading, because it's about, he says, or they say, that the feminine is the operating system of the 21st century success. And it's absolutely right. I mean, we're beginning to see that unless we work with compassion and inclusion and genuine intergenerational work too, we're not going to get to where we need to go. So I would recommend that you have a look at that. Let me just have a look. I don't want to take up too much time. But you'll also probably have studied Paul Hawkins' work on drawdown. And he pointed out that the 6th most important thing we can do for climate is to educate women and girls. And the British government actually took this to heart and had a very big program in the days when it was DFID. It doesn't have the same program anymore, sadly, because when you educate women and girls, or girls particularly, they have fewer children. And they also are the ones who, by and large, and you'll speak much more to this, I'm sure, those of you, are the ones who are the agricultural holders and producers in a significant way in the developing world, certainly. So it is a really important thing. And then we'll also discuss, I'm sure, going down the line, how they are also disproportionately affected because of the disasters that we're having. I mean, last year we had 30% of Pakistan underwater, right? So we owe Lawrence Tobiana and Mary Robinson and certainly Christiana Figueres a great debt of gratitude. The other piece of this is actually about self-awareness, because if we don't see that the climate crisis that we have is essentially a misunderstanding about who we are. It's a sense of separation from the earth that nurtures us, a separation from one another, and separation from ourselves. And when we understand intrinsically that we are nature, then you don't harm nature in quite the same way. So that's something that we try and foster in our network. So when Sally Rani, my co-founder, and I set up Global Choices, we decided these things are all theory. Let's put it into practice, right? Let's actually make this stuff happen. So we are an all-female-led organization. We have a lot of feminine male energy in our advisory board, but we set up a network called the Arctic Angels, and we focused on the Arctic, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but we focus on the Arctic because of all the systems. The Arctic is the apex system most at risk. We are possibly within 10 years of having an ice-free summer. And the cascade effect of this is phenomenal. I mean, really, really phenomenal. And the biggest challenge and the big aha moment for me, because I never ever thought I would be focusing on the Arctic, to be honest, the biggest aha moment was the realization that if we lose the Arctic, there is no recovery in our lifetime. Our strapline is you can't plant ice. And so that's why we focus on the Arctic. But we also decided that we have to take the long view, much like the indigenous do. You know, they look at 7 generations ahead. And that if we want to have more qualified female leaders in the climate space, we need to nurture them now. And so we have this network, as you say, we're now actually 67 in 35 countries, and Beth is one of our Arctic Angels. And they're all amazing young women, incredible young women. You know, we have the Youth Poet Laureate from the States. We have Shea Bastida, who's Greta's number 2. We have Beth. We have Vedika, who's also Cambridge doing law. We have some incredible young women leaders. And they mentor us as much as we mentor them. But it's also about understanding one another's perspectives, which is really important. So, you know, if you've got someone from India, which we do have, or from Colombia, you get a different view. You get the local view of what's really happening on the ground. Plus, you actually get a sense of where the common ground is, and there is a lot of common ground. So, so this Arctic Angels Network, we feel, is a real contribution. We'll continue to grow that probably to maybe 90, and then we'll have to figure out how to manage that one. But I've literally just come from Iceland this morning, and one of the things that we do is we bring young women onto the platform with us, high-level platforms. There's total equality to give a voice to the Arctic Angels to speak equally. So Reetika spoke at a very high-level shipping conference. Last COP, we had Prince Albert, we had Jan Rockström, whom I'm sure those of you who are studying climate know is the rock star of climate. We had Dr. Sylvia Earle, who's the female Jacques Cousteau. And then we had 2 Arctic Angels. We had Shreya from Nepal talking about the third pole. And it was just to give this voice, but also for the others to hear this wisdom voice too. Because wisdom is not a mistake. The wisdom, Sophia, is a feminine energy, but it's present in all generations, any age. It's not just the privilege of the oldies. That's just experience, but wisdom is very clearly in younger people. So that I know I'm sort of rambling a little bit, but I'm just sort of trying to set a bit of a scene for you. My sense of the importance of women in climate has come from working with women in peace building, because women are hugely underrepresented in peace building, and they have been hugely and still are hugely underrepresented in climate negotiations. Only about 37% of the delegations going to COP were these, I don't know if you've been to COP, but it's a bit of a jamboree, as you know. And behind the scenes, you have all these very busy little committees negotiating points. And only 37% of those have female leadership. And through a network called She Changes Climate, we are trying to push for joint leadership, a male and female leadership of COP in future for the presidency, because that should be the case. More than 50% of the world is female. So, sign up to She Changes Climate to support that, because again, taking the lesson from the first COP that Christiana, we need to keep that momentum going and not allow it to regress. So I think I'll probably stop there, because I think that we will be picking up on a bunch of things, and I'm sure I've used my allotted 5 minutes there. But
thank you for that introduction. So next we've got Emiliana, and she's a 22-year-old Colombian ecofeminist and activist. She is the co-founder of Latinos for Climate, an organization that seeks to raise awareness about the climate crisis, gender, human rights, and from a Latin American perspective. She is in her 2nd year of international relations at the University of Geneva and is a current intern at the NGO Peace Bridges International. Over the past 4 years, she's been organizer for different campaigns such as Latinos for Climate and Greenpeace at COP26 and Latinos to COP for COP27 to fight for more Latin American representation in those decision-making spaces, and the campaign for the ratification of the Isukazu Agreement.
Thank you for the invitation. Hello, everyone. So I think I want to start and to take also what has been said before, to go back, or maybe not go back. I think it depends on who you're talking to, because it'll be go back to think why the climate crisis is related to gender, actually. Because for some people, for some of us, I think it's obvious, but other people kind of forget that actually the climate crisis is completely related to human rights. And I think it happened to a lot of people, because it happened to me. And when I started activism, I wasn't aware that there was a connection and that they were related. And I started with the movement of Fridays for Future and zero waste and all of those things to recycle and everything, which is very good. And I started with that. I started being aware of the climate crisis because of that. But then I realized that it was more than that, and you cannot see the climate crisis as an ecological crisis and that's it. You need to go way further, which is when you realize, or when I realized, that it was also related to human rights and of course to gender. So why is it? Why are they related? And I think it's just, we need to think about the system itself, and it's all about our system, because we live in a capitalistic and oppressive system that exacerbates the inequalities. So that's when we can talk about gender. And not only gender, if we talk about the climate crisis and also climate justice, we need to think about social justice, racial justice, and of course gender justice. And we cannot just talk about one thing without thinking the others, because that will be being in the cycle and in the same system we're living in right now. So we need to think about the climate crisis with a intersectional approach, not only to think about the crisis, but also about the solutions. Because as you were saying, women are completely necessary to take the right solutions. And we saw that at COP21, and we can see it, and we see that there's a lack of women wisdom in these negotiations and in these spaces. That's also why it's so important to have representation, which we don't have enough. And it's not only about women, it's also about young women and girls and minorities, because as I said before, we need an intersectional approach, because if you don't think about all those things, and if we just focus on one, the others are behind and we'll keep this cycle. So in my point of view, for example, from where I come from, it's from Colombia. So we also need a global South perspective. We cannot continue these negotiations just focusing on the global North, which has been the case. So we need more representation to change and to break this cycle, to actually achieve the real solutions and the impactful solutions that we need. Because this year will be COP28, and we are still in the same case, in the same situation, in the same crisis. So as you were saying before, and as we all think, I hope, is we need more women and more Latin American women, more women from the global South, to change this cycle and to achieve the solutions that we need. So I think it's very important just to approach the climate crisis with that justice approach, having in mind and taking into consideration all the intersectional approaches. So I think this was more general an introduction, because I think it's important to just remember how important are human rights and just justice in general when we talk about the climate crisis.
Yeah, thank you for so clearly outlining the intersectionality within climate change. Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Reetika. And so she's the final year PhD candidate and Gates Cambridge Scholar at the University of Cambridge Centre for Gender Studies. And she's spent the past 14 years working as a journalist and researcher. Her work, spanning different media and platforms, primarily straddles the areas of gender-based violence, labour migration, and climate adaptation in South Asia. She's the founder and host of the Climate Brides podcast. She's the co-author of the multi-lingual comic book, Raindrop in the Drought, and the co-convenor of the Grammars of Marriage and Desire Research Network and the Womxn and Development Study Group. Thank you.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. And thank you very much for having me here. It is indeed an honor, and I'm really excited. And the best part about going at the end is that there's a lot of context that has already been set. And I hope by now you know that climate change is not gender neutral. And the ways in which we experience climate change really depends on who you are, where you come from, what sexuality you identify with, for instance, where you live, what class position you may hold, what caste you belong to. I mean, that becomes the vantage point in the ways in which one experiences, negotiates climate change. So in today's presentation, I thought I'll quickly give you an overview of 3 key points, and then we can probably dive deeper into some of these points in our discussion. So the first thing is a larger point around representation itself. This was something which I kept thinking about while I began my work in the areas of gender, climate change. And as a journalist, I work from the ground up. And, sort of experience becomes the very basis of the narratives that we form. And one of the things that kept bothering me, and especially when I was doing a PhD sitting here in Cambridge, which is quite distinct from the field sites that I was studying as part of my doctoral research, was in terms of representation itself of women and girls in climate change discourse and climate change policy, wherein we look at them as victims. There's a victim narrative. There's a rather simplistic narrative that is often used. And also lacking in resources of various types, they are actually portrayed as victims of development itself. But at the same time, they are the ones who are carrying the burdens of, survival, whether it is, accessing water, whether it is accessing fuel wood. They are sort of ensuring that the everyday survival of the household runs and is, kept going. So in some ways, not just to sort of what we need to think about in terms of representation, in terms of also like engaging with climate change and gender, one of the key points that I've also been grappling with is to look at situate these narratives at the center of these discussions and to sort of go beyond very simplistic narratives and a more nuanced narrative. And that is where my second point comes up, is wherein we need to look at, what she also highlighted, was to look at the more idea of nuance, which comes with the ideas around intersectionality, but to break down what intersectionality really means in everyday life. At no point, like you also mentioned, are you only a woman, or you are not only, a Dalit woman, for instance. You are, surviving and engaging with different identities and different sort of realities on a day-to-day basis. So climate change in some way perpetuates and aggravates pre-existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities. So for instance, in the area that I study as part of my research, which is also in the same state that I come from, in Maharashtra, which is in Western India, the region I study is Marathwada, which is a historically drought-prone region, which is one region where child marriage rates are extremely high. Farmer suicide rates are extremely high, and it is also considered to be like the drought capital of the country. And one of the things that kept coming up, for example, during the course of my discussion, was something in terms of accessing water during, a drought year. During the course of interviews, young women and girls, a lot of them said that, earlier in normal non-drought months, it would take, say, an hour and a half to queue up and get water from the well or get water from the water tankers that the government sent. But during a drought year, it would take up to 3 hours or 4 hours. It also meant a longer walk to get water. It also meant that you needed more people, more hands to carry those pots back home. And this in turn meant that a lot of young girls, who are also the people I've been working with as part of my research, were compelled to drop out of school, because your government tankers wouldn't come based on your school timings or, reproductive labor in the household of cooking, cleaning, washing, childcare. All of that started very early. And, some of the girls I interviewed who were in the ages of 8, 10, 12 were already sort of, working as substitutes for the women in the household, their mothers, and, really actively participating in drought played a key role. So what I'm trying to say is that these gender relations already existed. I mean, we are talking about institutions which are like patriarchy, for instance, already exists, but climate change in some way increases these existing vulnerabilities in everyday survival. So that was something which I think is very important to think through. Similarly, in Bangladesh, for instance, after the cyclone Sidr in 2007, we were informed how a lot of schools shut down, because schools served as shelters for, people to rehabilitate them as shelter homes. And in these places, the immediate trade-off was young girls dropped out of school and many never came back to school. The return rate was not as high because they again became a very important part of household survival. Their labor was very, very much integrated into household survival and just everyday sort of, coping with these situations. So that's my second point. And the third point that I wanted to make is also something which I've been trying to look at as part of my research, as well as the Climate Brights podcast and the project that I started 2 years ago with support from the university, wherein I interview different stakeholders from South Asia in particular, because South Asia as a region has the highest rate of child marriages in the world. I think nearly 45% of the global child brides come from this particular region. And it is also ecologically vulnerable extremely vulnerable. And so one of the things that I started doing was talk to different stakeholders, frontline workers, journalists, activists, academics in and from the region to try and understand what climate change really means for young women and girls on an everyday basis. I mean, not from a conceptual perspective, but what it means on an everyday basis. And, some of the things that came up, I focused on child marriage as an institution, which probably climate change and child marriage might not directly seem like there's a link. But, when I started speaking to more people and, through my own doctoral research, some of the things that came up were interesting to sort of look at marriage itself as a labor institution, marriage itself as a compulsory institution in that part of the world, in my part of the world. So in some ways to look at how climate change, for example, there is, say, a heat wave, say there is an extreme cyclone or a flood. How does that impact marriage decisions in the household? So I'll just give you a quick example before I wrap up. So for instance, in Afghanistan, I was speaking to a journalist over there who was working on stories on the internally displaced persons camps, IDP camps, which were set up following the droughts. And she was saying in terms of how, the concept of like bridal payments become very, very crucial, which is already a system that exists. So it goes back to the earlier point I was making, wherein these systems already exist. But then when you have an extreme event or you put in extreme particular circumstances, for example, a relief camp or a rehabilitation camp, that particular sum of money plays a very, the role of it sort of changes or it gets further intensified. So for instance, she was talking about how her mother had 4 daughters and she was a single mother. It was a single woman-led household. So for her, that toina, the money that was used as a bridal payment, was so crucial that, in exchange of 2 cows, for instance, and a sack full of rice, she was willing to, give her daughter away. So it is, again, not necessarily, it's not that she doesn't love her daughters or, we need to villainize or criminalize, but it's also sort of looking at the whole political economy that is at work and what climate change or those circumstances really do to existing household dynamics. So that is one example. Another quick example I thought I could share right now was to do with the Black Friday, like the tsunami that took place in South India and, Sri Lanka in 2004. It's called the Boxing Day tsunami, and several thousands of people died and they, lost their lives, lost their livelihoods. And one thing that emerged was this whole idea of tsunami brides. It's also been reported quite a bit. And what really emerged was that there were state schemes for, accessing, so for example, house grains or accessing relief and care, which were given in pairs as, husband and wife in that sense, or, given to male householders. That is one reason. Another reason was living in relief camps, needing protection. Like marriage became like a security blanket for a lot of young women and girls to, sort of survive any form of sexual violence in those peculiar circumstances. So in these circumstances, the rates of child marriages really increased at quite an alarming rate. So in some ways, sort of looking at how marriage sort of is not just it's a means of climate adaptation, climate maladaptation, but also look at what are the implications on households. So finally, I think, I was thinking that, what we really need to do ahead, like we've been talking about 7 issues. I think one thing that we need to do is contextually embedded research is very, very important to sort of understand while we do need universal broader narratives because we are living in a global world, at the same time, it is really important to not forget the nuance, not forget like local relationships and stakeholders while thinking about climate change. And secondly, I think what is really important is, especially talking about young women and girls as, the primary users, as the primary collectors of resources, it's really important, like you also highlighted, to have them in these discussion boards and, policy making and research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing in the lived experience, especially through that specific avenue of the child brides. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the floor if you have any questions for our panelists. So start thinking. So my first question is building on what you were saying about the femininities and like men having that. So often I think when discussing gender and climate, gender comes to be synonymous with women. But actually, if we reframe the debate to centre masculinities and femininities and look at the role that gender plays in people's responses to climate change.
Yeah, I do think it's really important, and of course, it's a bit of a minefield nowadays because there's you don't dare say male, female, or whatever because there's such sensitivities, and rightly so. But it is this feminine energy that is the thing that we need, because I've watched this happen in peace negotiations and in climate negotiations, that it's an inherent sort of strong male thing about territory. So, there's been a war and the men are still fighting about what they were fighting for anyway in the war, right? So let's negotiate around the table, but I still want this peace. Whereas having a majority of women in a peace negotiation means that they say, look, let's figure out a way to solve this, because what we want peace so that we can go back to our homes, have our men back home, get our kids back into school and have some normal life. So it is a different sort of form of resolution that comes from that. But yeah, I'm sure you've got, and also of course it varies from culture to culture, without question. It's very interesting that in the COP negotiations, some of the higher rates of representation come from the Latin countries, whereas the lower rates of feminine representation or female representation comes within the least developed countries, from Southeast Asia, but also from it's changing a bit in the Middle East, but certainly the CARICOM countries, the Caribbean countries. It's very few. And if any of you follow Mia Motley, definitely worthwhile following her, because she's got some very interesting things to say too, around the economics of the justice, of climate justice, which we can get into a separate.
Yeah, no, I think it's also important just to think about, as I said before, the system we live in, because sexism in general has a massive role. And even it doesn't just affect women in general, also men are affected by the system we live in. So I think it's important just to think in general. And at the end, it's not, of course, it's about gender, and women are important. But the most important thing is just to change the system. And also, as you were saying, sometimes we have representation, but it's just not enough. And for example, we have a lot of representation from Latin America, but not enough women-led movements or in COP in general. And it's not, we can't generalize, because sometimes we will talk to a woman and she will say completely the opposite, because her government, it's different. And it depends on how it works and on the country we're talking about, but it's also cultural. And of course, it's completely different if we talk about Colombia or also India or in Europe in general. But for example, when I was in COP 26, I met with the environmental minister of Colombia, which he basically said that human rights were not connected to the climate crisis. And then a year later, the government changed, and this time it was a woman, and she is amazing. She was actually an activist before being a minister, and then everything changed. So it's not about, I can't say that it was about gender, but at the same time, you do feel that the perspective changes, and so it's not a specific thing. But at the same time, is the feminine energy that you were mentioning, and also cultural and political at the same time. So as I said before, we need to approach it with several point of views and several aspects just to answer the question, or to approach it in general.
Can I just comment on that? Sorry, I don't want to. None of me the please. It's very important to have role models. And what is emerging is also very important to have leaders that have the experience of grassroots and knowledge and connected with grassroots. Because we've seen, particularly in Western politics, this huge gulf between the lived reality for the majority and the sort of elitism and the theory. And when you're starting, like in Canada, the Minister of Environment is an Indigenous woman. She understands what the battle is. and the same Miyamoto, understands what the battle is. And the more of these genuinely representative voices we can have, and that, of course, is a very slow process because you've got to embed them into the political process as well, in order to get these decision makers in the places that they're in. So, but it is beginning to shift. I mean, when you look at, I know this is a Western, well, actually, it's true also in Southeast Asia. There's some women ministers, but you look at Godavari, who's in the European Union. You've got Christine Lagarde, the bank. You've got women leading institutions, Ursula von der Leyen, which is a big shift, and they are more inclined to bring in the perspectives of what's really happening at grassroots, and that is fundamental because one of the big failures we have, one of the very big reasons for climate change is this huge disconnect, between the business, corporates, those who are emitting, and those who aren't. So, sorry.
Right. Yeah, and I think as an extension to that, one of the things I thought, again, in terms of experiences is also sexual minorities who are, quite invisible in the larger discourse around like climate change and gender. So, for instance, I was recently reading an article in Indonesia, and I'm part of a gender and climate change network. One of the things was like a lot of trans persons in like Indonesia were talking about how in like urban settlements, accessing any form of state services, whether it is accessing food supplies or accessing, any form of necessities at that point in time, were very difficult because of your sexuality or, in terms of how the state systems are sort of governed, or are sort of even like trans persons in Tamil Nadu in like southern India have recorded similar experiences because, like I was making a point earlier, how climate change sort of intensifies existing sort of structural sort of barriers that exist. It sort of brings it to the fore, like what we saw during the pandemic as well. These were not new sort of challenges. These were just challenges multiplied by 100, which came to the fore. So in some ways, I think what climate change does, or, what these conversations like this really do is how it sort of brings to the fore, like some of these existing underlying patriarchal structures, for instance, and sort of, brings it to the fore, and it becomes even more essential for us to look at the structures at work, and deal with the root cause of cure the disease and not just the symptoms in some ways. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And then also lots of the rhetoric surrounding the responses to climate change say, think of your children, think of your grandchildren, and it's always looking at the future. So do you think that for women pulls on their maternal instincts and then leads women to care more deeply about climate change?
I think it's also like the idea around, maternal instincts, yes, but it again goes back to who is sort of governing the domestic labor in the household, who is really facing the brunt of, having limited resources, for instance, or who is actually facing the brunt of not having access to decision-making, for instance, like you were discussing earlier. I think I would probably look at it from that perspective in terms of actually experiencing climate change firsthand, not just as a conceptual idea, but as a lived reality. So one of the things, like, just to quickly say was, one of the questions that I keep asking in my podcast, or also in terms of my own research, is what does climate change really mean? It's almost like feminism, which is an idea which is important, which sort of also is a consolidation of different ideas and experiences. But in reality, a lot for them, it was about, having longer distances to cover to collect water. It is also about like having lesser food on the plate, or, it's also about withering crops. So, it's sort of, and these experiences, I think, are, closely, experienced by women and girls largely in that sense in agricultural households. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that I never thought about that from that perspective, but I think it comes from a very privileged perspective of saying, think about the future generations, your children. It's not affecting us right now. And I feel that is very from the global north, because it's true that it's not affecting them as it is affecting the global south, because it's not that the climate crisis is a future crisis. It can be for the people who are not feeling and seeing the consequences right now, but a lot of countries and a lot of regions from the global south are suffering the consequences right now. So I feel it's also a speech used to give people more time and feel, we can keep destroying the planet, keep buying, keep investing in fossil fuels because we have time. But actually, who has time? I feel it's more from that perspective, but at the same time, it intensifies the system we have. So at the end, it can be related to that as well, and to make people feel guilty.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view on that, and it comes from working in the Middle East and wanting to change the dynamics and getting more women into management and more women involved in decision making. And the biggest, most successful way was to speak to fathers who have daughters. That was really interesting because they suddenly realized that their daughters would face massive inequalities, and then they got all huffy about that. And then they become activated to do something. So I don't think the maternal instinct is exclusively female at all. But I do think that there's nothing wrong with looking. I mean, that's the wisdom of indigenous communities, is they take the long view, and you plant a tree not for yourself, but you plant it for future generations. And that's the problem that we've had, is our economic system is so short term, and we don't take the long view and say, and the same with our decisions on climate, on the causes of climate. But to your point, I think we are now, let's be clear, folks, this is not going to be the next generation's issue. We are facing radical climate change right now. I mean, you look what happened in Brussels, you look what's happened in New York a month ago, you look what happened in Greece, you got 3 months worth of rain, look what's happened in Scotland. The climate is changing radically, and we are seeing a systemic collapse of systems and tipping points that are some of them going to be very, very hard to ameliorate. So this is going to be an every generation effort. And I also would like to say to you, because you're so much, you're young people and you're looking ahead, and one of the narratives that really scares me when people say, I don't want children because of climate change. And I'm thinking, this is crazy stuff, because actually, I think if we get, and if we make, that's why we call global choices, if we make the really good choices now, and it's beginning to happen because nature's the teacher, right? We're beginning to realize this is not somewhere in the future. This is very, very real. And I've just been with some of the global leaders in climate change, and they are seeing the risks of sea level rise and the fact that the Marshall Islands and Samoa will be underwater. But the other piece of this is the exciting piece, which we really must not lose sight of, because there is so much interesting stuff happening, and it's your generation going to reap that. You'll have clean air, you'll have electric cars, or whatever other form of car you'll have. I mean, think about the potential. This transformed everything. There will be something like this that will transform everything in energy. And your careers, you can align what you want to do with purpose. We didn't have that choice, I mean, that could be a teacher or an architect or, there were a few, but to be have a purpose-driven career, and without question, climate will impact every single career that you face. And that's why you're very smart to be studying climate change and sustainability, because whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a marketeer, whether you're producing goods, we will have to change, or whether you're in finance, we will have to change every single system we have in order to successfully get ourselves out of this hole that we're in. So, but be glad, because there's an enormous amount of exciting stuff happening. There are wonderful technologies happening. And I know this will scare some of you, and it scared me, but looking at how can we, how can we use artificial intelligence to really get the sort of data we need fast, so that we can make the right decisions. And the sciences, I mean, there's some fantastic stuff being done in sciences, and for once we're beginning to understand this is all connected. It's not just this bit of science here and that bit of science there. It's seeing this beauty of the whole. I think it's an immensely exciting. I'm quite envious, actually. I would like to have another, several decades, but it's not going to happen unless science finds something.
Yeah. So I've got one last question before we open up the floor. So lots of about climate change, they talk about overpopulation. And so I was wondering whether you think that climate change could have an impact on women's reproductive rights if, say, the state got involved.
The state got involved. This is your territory.
I think reproductive rights stands at the very center of, any household decision, for instance, coping with climate change. I mean, I'm talking from a very ground up perspective, and I think I'll be able to also lend the broader sort of, play the broader strokes. But, I'll give you an example. I mean, in terms of what has been happening in terms of, like you said, climate change is something which has already been happening. It's our reality, and, it's not something wherein we're looking forward to it, or, it's not something in the looming future. But, so for instance, in the region that I work and do my doctorate, I'm studying is a region, as I said, called Marathwada, which is historically drought prone. And one of the key aspects over there that has, over the years, been reported quite widely, even in the global media, has been the rise of hysterectomies among very young women. In their 20s and, early 30s, they're already undergoing hysterectomies. And the reasons are far too many. One of the things is, of course, early marriages. And the second thing is that, which again, like climate change is not just an ecological factor, is to do with the rise in sugarcane cultivation. Sugarcane is a historically extractive crop we've seen globally. And in the region that I am studying and working out of, sugarcane is ironically the reason for increased drought, dropping groundwater levels, but at the same time is also the key source of livelihood for a lot of people in this situation. They join the sugarcane workforce as laborers to harvest cane. And the recruitments take place in pairs as husband and wife. So, which in turn has sort of led to having more marriages to join the workforce, which over a period of time with more droughts and lesser water has led to younger couples or earlier marriages to join the workforce. And all the implications of that, of very hardcore labor and, not having access to, menstrual health products or, not having access to toilets, has actually led to a lot of has had reproductive implications. And so, in some ways, it sort of you can see how, access to water, scarcity of water, a very extractive sugarcane industry, which is, capitalism 101, and as well as, having existing sort of gender relations comes together and sort of having these sort of wider implications on young bodies. So that's just an example in terms of how it really plays out at the ground. But I think y'all can, yeah.
Okay. I think that makes it proves very clear. I just want to add that it's just important to have in mind that the narrative that has been used for forever and in the past several years, is also, it comes from the West and it comes from the North. And sometimes when we think, like, they always use that argument, that overpopulation in China, and they always use the same argument. But at the same time, if we look, I don't know, to the US, there's a lot of people who use a lot of resources. So at the end, I think it's just important to have in mind the narrative that is being used and from what's the actual objective from it. And I wanted to add that because I think it's very important.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I do think that overpopulation is a bit of a red herring when it comes to it, because it is in the global south where they have less impact, that they're having a greater number of children.
I'm entirely going to agree. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. That's what universities are for, to disagree. Because I do think education is really key, as Hawkins says, and it's not because there is any attribution of blame. But we are too many people on a relatively finite planet, and we are consuming. Doesn't matter where, we're north, south, or I agree. The north is consuming more, but Southeast Asia is catching up. There's there's this, and the reality is, and we will have to change how we produce in order to be able to do that. I mean, we I think it's about August 27th or something. We hit the finite for our budget for the year of consumption. So I don't entirely agree with you that it's not about population. It is about population, but we hate to speak about it because it always gets attributed as it's a blame game. It's a numbers game, really. And I think we have to take it in the context of what can this little planet of ours support? And how do we stop food waste, which of course is one of the massive emitters? It's a big thing. How do we actually distribute food more evenly? And then the other piece that came to mind when you were speaking was this relationship between climate change and health. And as climate change starts rampaging, and for instance, you get sea level rise, you're going to have inundation of freshwater systems with salt water. That leads to kidney problems. It needs, things like the massive droughts that you begin to have, a third of Pakistan underwater already, floods. And if you can't feed your family, you get on the move. And that's when you start having the predatory issues that you have with people trafficking children, for instance. But more particularly, you also have this social unrest, but you also have a lot of ill health, which must affect reproductive health ultimately. I mean, I haven't looked at the stats or haven't studied it, you probably have, but general health will decline because A, we can't feed all these people, and B, they're on the move. And the systems are not going to be looking after people. Doesn't matter whether you're north, south, east, or west. The systems are not equipped currently. There is no system that will actually cope with what is coming down the line if we don't get our emissions down. And that will affect reproductive health too. So I'm just sort of making broad brush connections here, but it's not as far-fetched as it sounds.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're now going to open up to the floor. So if anyone has any questions, just raise your hand. Would you like to stand up?
Hi, I'm very nice in so I mean, I study geography and I use a lot of climate and gender things, but as a student in Cambridge, and how I want to kind of have my environment hat and things like that. Is there a way for us ourselves to try and take into a more gender perspective and climate change in the way that we actually live our lives, or is this very much a policy and education kind of thing that is way above, for example, how we live our daily lives?
I think it's important. Everyone has an impact, and whenever it comes from. So I think it's important, if you just talk about the climate crisis, having in mind that it is not just an ecological crisis and that you have an impact on it coming from a gender role and just related to feminism. I feel like just the fact that we're speaking about it, it's already something. Of course, it's not enough, and of course, we need to do a lot of things. But the fact that people are starting to notice and to be aware that it's way more than just they say and we think, it's just already something. And especially in a university as well, if we, as you said, education is very important. So I think this is the place to do it. So I think that's the way to start. And of course, in policies is very important, but at the end, who are the ones voting for the politicians and for these policies to be real? So at the end, it's very important to just talk about it.
And I think just to add to that, I think, when I'm at the university, and one of the things that I've been consciously trying to do is read more about, places that we don't come from. I think it's really important, and a place like Cambridge over here gives you the access to actually, look at different kinds of narratives. So one of the things that I've been trying to do even through my work is to look at women's poetry, for instance, which might not necessarily be an immediate resource. But I look at labor songs of women from South Asia, and there's a lot of understanding of the history of climate change, which is, again, as I was saying earlier, not defined as climate change, but as experiences. So I think one of the things is also like exposing ourselves to different forms of knowledge or different vantage points of knowledge as well. So I think that will be something which we have the luxury to do sitting here. Yeah.
I think that's such an important point, is remember, that our point of view is not the only one. And it's our place in geography, turn the world the other way around, and suddenly you see a very different world. And also to make sure that your own voice is heard. Be bold about making sure your voice is heard, and using that generosity of spirit to allow and make sure that others are heard too. Because, McKinsey, this comes from the business negotiation narrative, but when you needed 3 women on a board to begin to really get heard, which is interesting. And so I'm sure that same principle applies. Just be sensitive to making sure that others are also being heard. And I mean, it's fantastic to be doing what you're doing, because it sets you up to get a sense of the system and the place we're living in.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi, I'm the partnership of the Senator Commodore Bay and their years of Cambridge. And thank you again for I mentioned it up really quickly, but I had a question specifically on kind of more actionable points for the upcoming COP28. Because I know it's specifically is a bit more of a controversial COP28 yourself, where it's held and who's president and then the kind of stuff, money, waters, shouldn't. But I'd really like to get your opinion on what are your hopes, and then, any action points for this upcoming COP.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people share the discomfort of having a COP hosted by one of the great emitting countries. On the other hand, just this last week, I was listening to the president of COP speak, and his aspiration. Now, of course, that's, as we well know, what you say and what you do is 2 different things. But they have actually, interestingly enough, Almiri, his environment minister, was with us, and they have appointed quite a few women in roles, which is really good news. I think it's going to be a very big wake-up call, because this is the fifth year post-Paris, where you're beginning to evaluate how well we're doing against the 1.5. And we ain't doing very well, I'm afraid. As you know, our emissions are just still going very much in the wrong direction. So I'm hoping it'll be a wake-up call. I'm not entirely sure that we aren't seeing a shift anyway from everything being COP-centric as being the place where stuff happens, because some stuff happens there, but actually I'm seeing a lot of other stuff happening in different places. Like I've just been in Iceland. The real stuff around the Arctic is happening, and Antarctica is happening really in places like that. Next month, there'll be a very big cryosphere convening by President Macron. So I think people are realizing that the COP is not the only place. So there was one time that was sort of this sort of everyone pinned their hopes on COP. I think actually there's also an enormous shift to grassroots impacts happening and grassroots pressure. I think we'll wait and see, but I have seen commentaries that if this COP should fail, that means I think the COP process fails. But I don't want you to then think we're done for, because I just came from New York last month. Sounds terrible, my carbon footprint, but we do offset. And there was, for the first time, I was incredibly encouraged, because you may have heard about something called the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty, which has been 16 years in the making. It looks at areas that are beyond national jurisdiction, largely the oceans, right? But it's the biodiversity piece, because we've been focused so much on carbon, and COP still focuses a lot on carbon and needs to. But, the Earth systems are much more than this, right? It's people, it's biodiversity. So this was a very, very important biodiversity treaty, and it nearly didn't get across the line. It was a huge effort to get across the line in August at the UN. And then last month, it was when you started getting the signatories at the UN. And it was a complete sea change. It was a total eye-opener. We went thinking we have to lobby this government, that government, the next government to sign it. 71 countries signed in 2 days. And listening to the leaders speak, it was not just, here's your speech and, say this stuff, it's lip service. There was such a genuine sense of reality playing out and wanting to try and remedy it genuinely, that it was very exciting. I mean, it was for the first time, especially when, Ukraine and all the multilateral processes are breaking down, seeing a multilateral process, but also seeing the leaders enjoying a multilateral process and being empowered and seeing the value of working collectively. So I reckon this might be the fastest ratified treaty of all time, and it's a really important treaty. So stuff like that is still happening. So don't just pin hopes on COP, and if COP doesn't deliver, we'll figure out another way to make stuff deliver. Just because we have to. And included, actually, I had it yesterday with some people from the Centre for Climate Repair.
So thank you very much for that, Emiliana. Thank you all so much for coming to speak. So we've got a drink reception next door. So we've got some wine and some out of that for those of you that don't want to drink alcohol. Which is certain and to stay then.
And